Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I especially wanted to thank Dr. Bradley, Dr. Piccolo or Myron, and Dr. Bellet. You guys are really wonderful. I've heard amazing things from students and from professors and also Cole. So this was really wonderful to be able to put together because Harvard Extension School has a big veteran population, and it's really important that we have events like this. So we really appreciate you agreeing to do this. And I don't want to take too much time because you have a lot of great information to share. So I'm going to hand it over to our amazing new veteran coordinator, Cole. So go ahead, Cole.
All right. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here. We may have a few people jump in a couple minutes late, but that's not an issue. Everyone who's here, thank you. And then everyone who's watching on the YouTube recording later, also welcome. We are very honored. We have three amazing guests today, and they're all going to be presenting some of their work. So first up, we have Dr. John Bradley. He is currently serving as the Director for Mental Health at the VA Boston Healthcare System, and he's an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He retired from the Army, where he served as the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and clinical professor of psychiatry and vice chair at the Uniformed Services University. A lot of his published research is focused on treatment of combat trauma and PTSD and the management of suicide risk. And he is very highly decorated in terms of military and teaching awards. And so we're very honored to have him here. Additionally, we have Dr. Mayron here. He's originally from Brazil. He's a psychologist and behavior analyst. He works on exploring the impact of rewards on enhancing the lives of historically marginalized groups, such as individuals with psychiatric disorders, immigrants, and refugees. He is a lecturer at Harvard University, where he's won many teaching excellence awards, and he is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University. He integrates his teachings with real-world applications, partnering with NGOs to develop scientifically informed mental health resources, and he's going to be giving us some of that multicultural considerations today. And then finally, we have Dr. Benjamin Bellet. Ben grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, earned a bachelor's in kinesiology at West Point, and then commissioned as an infantry officer in the US, where he served for 5 years, deploying twice. Following his service, he earned a master's of science in general psychology at the University of Memphis, and then most recently his PhD in clinical psych at Harvard, where his doctoral research focused on how humans make meaning out of loss and trauma. He is currently a psychologist at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center in Boston, where he treats young adults with serious mental illnesses. He's also a published poet and an avid explorer of the New English coastline. And I believe, if my ability to read on LinkedIn is correct, you have also started recently your own private practice that we didn't have in the bio. So congratulations, Ben, on that.
Thank you.
For everybody who is watching, we are going to have a presentation from each of these speakers independently. If you have any questions for them, feel free to put them in chat. We're going to do a Q&A once all of the presentations are over, and then we'll go from there. So the order of the speakers is going to be Dr. Bradley, Myron, and then Ben. So Dr. Bradley, you have the floor.
Great. I'm looking for the screen share option here. It says it's been disabled. Post-disabled participant screen sharing.
I think it should be, I just allowed multiple. I hope it's okay. I hope it's working.
Let's see. Let's try that. Here we go. Okay. Are you able to see my opening slide?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for the kind invitation to participate with this esteemed panel and talk a little bit about combat trauma as one of the risk factors for developing PTSD. You know, as I work in the VA and retired after a 30-year career in the military, this topic is near and dear to my heart, both professionally and personally. I had the good fortune a number of years ago working with HBO and James Gandolfini to develop a documentary that covers the history of our thinking about combat stress and PTSD. And I'll share one vignette from that documentary in this talk. But let's go ahead and get started. Again, standard disclaimer, these views are my own, not the DOD's or the VA's. HBO did kindly grant screening rights for the portions that I'm showing. I want to thank all of the people who were involved in the production of this documentary, which is available on YouTube, and I'm happy to share the link to that. But most importantly, to our current and former service members who are being placed in harm's way in service to the nation, and therefore developing illnesses such as PTSD, or some people will refer to post-traumatic stress, eschewing the disorder part of that. So we'll cover a little bit of the history. We'll talk about what we've come to understand is PTSD, and maybe even talk a little bit about some of the treatments, the pathophysiology, et cetera. But let's start with the history. PTSD, although a new diagnosis in terms of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the APA, is a well-known phenomenon throughout history. They're written about with various frameworks from various authors and philosophers and military leaders throughout the years. I think no discussion of military operations is complete without a Sun Tzu quote. We learned that at the Army's Command and General Staff College. When you do battle, even if you're winning, if you continue for a long time, it will dull your forces and blunt your edge. So the simple wear and tear of being exposed to combat is important. He also says that a nation is foolish who raises troops twice, and our current operational tempo calls for deploying troops twice and thrice and so on. So we sometimes fail to learn the lessons that have been taught. The images around this quote are various military leaders. Johannes Hofer was the first during the 30 Years' Wars in Europe to talk about this notion of nostalgia, longing for home and hearth and peace and comfort. Served under Frederick the Great. Baron Leray in the Crimean Wars from France really was the first to define the echelons of medical care, that when you keep troops as close to their unit in the front lines as possible, their ability to return to those units and serve effectively in combat again is increased. Jonathan Letterman of the Army of the Potomac in the American Civil War was the first to translate Leray's work into doctrine for the US military, and has been a foundation for the combat stress doctrine that has been developed through this day. There are a couple really important books I think required reading for anybody working in this area. One of them is Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam. Dr. Shea was a psychiatrist here at the Boston VA for a number of years, retired back, I think, 2010, and really drew the narrative, pulled that thread from the time of Achilles and Homer's work to the current time, and really talked about some very important concepts that contribute to the development of combat stress and PTSD. One of the foundational traumas in military operations is this notion of betrayal of what's right. We all grow up in societies where we have an inherent sense of what is right and wrong. Murder and violence being chief amongst them. And yet when we join the military, we are trained to kill and destroy things. And so that represents a cognitive dissonance for people that has to be reconciled, either through justifying that violence, or when unable to do so, develops this moral dissonance that people really talk about, this moral injury that has to be understood and reconciled. So war is dangerous. The opening slide said Surgeon General's warning, war is bad for your health. When I started giving this talk quite a number of years ago, the Army Surgeon General said, come on, Bradley, you know, I never really said that. I said, yes, sir, but you know, that's true. And we have to acknowledge that as military physicians. And so he said, okay, you can use that tagline. Dr. Shea also talks about shrinkage of the social and moral horizon, that the further we get away from our home society on a battlefield, on extensive deployments, that what's right and wrong becomes narrowed. And that this sets the risk factor up for war crimes and other things that you would never tell anybody back in your hometown that you did, but you do it in combat under the cloak of service to the country. Grief and mourning the death of a special comrade is a universal theme. Every soldier that I work with on active duty and in the VA is continuing to grieve those friends that they have lost in combat. And so that is a very important component of PTSD. Guilt and wrongful substitution has to do with this feeling that the people who were killed were inherently better than you in some very important sense, and that it would have been better if you were killed than they were. And that's part of the guilt reaction that people often deal with. We also have to acknowledge the frankly toxic culture, both in the United States. You can talk about toxic masculinity, but we in the military embrace this stoic movement. And so Nancy Sherman really talks about stoicism, and it's really worth reading the Stoics, who talk about the virtue of suffering and privation. And that's certainly, well embraced in the military. We, always have a saying, if it ain't raining, it ain't training. And we embrace the misery of the privation of deployed settings as somehow marks of toughness and, if you will, manhood. So let's talk about PTSD. PTSD is a syndrome. It is an illness that develops when our ability to mobilize our psychological defenses is overwhelmed. And everybody has that threshold. Depending on the level of resilience and psychological mindedness and maturity and other health attributes that one develops, can certainly influence the threshold at which PTSD symptoms occur. That is why when childhood trauma occurs, it quickly overwhelms the child and can lead to a lifetime of symptoms. And similarly for the service member, with the horrific exposures that we are exposed to in a military context, whether that is combat operations, witnessing the death of a friend in combat, military sexual trauma, and other sorts of traumatic events. But the DSM-5 talks about PTSD criterion A symptoms that are being exposed to death, serious injury, or sexual violence, which is an improvement over the previous criteria, which intimated that you had to be exposed to something that was, quote, outside the realm of human experience. And all of these things are definitely within the realm of human experience and all too common. And then a symptom complex that includes a number of intrusion symptoms, avoidance symptoms, changes in cognition and mood, and the hallmarks, hyperarousal and reactivity to symbolic representations of the traumatic events. So that is the overall construct that we deal with, and we see no two people with PTSD are the same. And I've seen hundreds of different variations on the theme that meet criteria for this, and it really depends on a whole host of predisposing factors and attitudes and beliefs and cognitions that people come to that traumatic experience with. So I won't get too far into the weeds in terms of the pathophysiology of PTSD. Let me oversimplify by saying that the amygdala is the exchange gate for managing high stress emotional content, and that when we are overwhelmed with stress, our HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, runs into overdrive. That cortisol surge interrupts the amygdala's ability to organize experiences to the visual, auditory, smell, and hippocampal cortices, and those memories get stored improperly, and that leads to some of the re-experiencing and disconcerted auditory, visual, smell experiences associated with PTSD. There are quite a number of excellent monographs that review the evidence base for the treatment of PTSD. I won't get into those in much detail. That would take much longer than the time allotted for today. But these resources are available, and I'm happy to share my slides. So let's go into one of the vignettes. I believe this is the World War II vignette from the War-Torn documentary that really describes some of the setups for developing chronic symptoms of PTSD.
I enlisted when I was 17 and a half. I forged my mother's signature because 18 was the age. I enlisted in the Air Force, and I wound up as a co-pilot on a B-24. The heartbreak was you would fly with a flight of 4 planes, and you look by and you find 2 went down alongside of you. And you look around, and then you'd see 1 spinning out of sight. You know that 10 men went down. And then you see if you would count the chutes and see if they came out. If nothing came out, then you know it was an awful loss. You would take the fellas out, the horrible things that they had, the faces gone, the bodies exposed, trying to hold their guts together, all this. I hate to even talk about it. We're really scared because sometimes they pepper the living hell out of you. I came back from one mission with over 300 holes in the aircraft. You get on the ground and said, I'm not going. I'm not going. I'm going to get killed the next time I'm over there.
In the old days, it was called battle fatigue, and it was a no-no. Nobody wanted to get stuck with battle fatigue.
Lack of intestinal fortitude, they would put in your record. And nobody would want that. You didn't want that on the, that was the worst thing. But I found out that everybody has a breaking point.
I felt like I was the only one in the whole world that came out of the war with something wrong with my head. I never even talked to my own wife about the war. I didn't think it was a good thing to bring up. We had separate beds because I had bad nightmares and came flying off the bed, screaming my mother's name out. I couldn't tell anybody. I thought every bartender in Brooklyn was my psychiatrist. I was in the 213 anti-aircraft battery. We landed in North Africa, and we took an awful shellacking up there. We were in severe bombing and shelling. I kept praying the Hail Mary. And I started to get very severe headaches, and I wound up home January 7th, 1945. The war was still on.
You see the guilt he still has.
And 2 weeks later, I wound up in the Bronx 81, and they put me in the cycle ward. There's an awful lot of guilt in thinking that you should have done better. I was having bad nightmares. I still had bad nightmares, and it takes all goddamn night to kill somebody.
You weren't the same when you went away. You went away as a young kid down here. You came back. Some of us came back as war weary. You were not normal in any aspect at all. It wasn't, you didn't get out of there and the next day sit down at the table and say, well, I'm home now and we can go on from there. And that didn't work at all. That adjustment was tough. It was extremely tough. I come back as a raving lunatic. I want to say at the flying, I couldn't get I was lucky I got a driving license. And I was so crazy in the place, I lost that one in about a month because I had about 4 drunk driving on there. Going through lights meant nothing to me. Speeding meant nothing to me. I was totally uncontrollable. I lost 8 jobs in 1 week. I had nobody to turn to. Nobody. Went to the VA. They had an onslaught. So many people there. They just, yeah, take these pills and go home. You'll be fine. No psychiatric help. No, nobody understood PTSD. Nobody understood it. They stopped at it. Nonsense. They're faking. So you took the drink like that, and a bad marriage, abusive father, my fault. My marriage, my fault. I'm not blaming anybody else. Like that, it took me a long while to cope. A long while. Today, my children do still not talk to. They do not talk to me. I have 3 boys that I haven't seen in 25 years.
Everything that was horrible stayed with me. Never could talk. I have 4 kids, and they never even knew I was in the Marine Corps. I couldn't get anything out. There was no. All I could do was inhale. I could never exhale. I was in the 4th Marine Division. They had been to Saipan, Tinian, and the last one was Iwo Jima, was where I got hit. First landing, the first day, I lost everybody but 3. That evening, a mortar shell hit gun emplacement we were at and killed Barney, who was a corporal with us, and also Schultz, who were my closest friends. But Schultz was still alive. He got hit in the head. And I held him in my arms all night. and got them back to the beach in the morning. And that was what Iwo Jima was about. It was a killing field. And it just goes inside. You can't get it out. Because it's like you have a camera in you.
During the bulge, we were dug in and there were only two of us. And we looked out and there were 4 German soldiers coming. No, I break up on, I'm sorry. Because we shot them. One of them was alive, but I don't know whether he was just passing away gradually. However, he pointed to, his pocket. Family. So we took it out, and there was a picture of his children and his wife. And he passed away. When you see a man with his children and his family, he's just like we are.
How do you explain to anybody the horrors that you saw and touched and just soaked into your whole body, your brain, your mind, everything? It finally consumes you if you let it. I have a grandson who's in Iraq now, who's first lieutenant, but every time he goes out in the field for 2 weeks and I don't hear from him, I'm landing again. The bed, all the bad that can come up, comes up. I know, but how can I tell my grandson that he's not coming home the same person that left? I wasn't the same person that left.
So I think those vignettes really tell the story more effectively than I could ever. And highlight some of the common symptoms of PTSD, the guilt, the nightmares, the flashback, the reliance on substances for soothing, and the destruction of individual lives and families in the wake of combat. So let me shift and recognizing that we have very limited time, talk a little bit about my experience in Iraq. As a psychiatrist running a combat stress control unit, which is meant to provide early intervention for combat trauma, as well as treat common mental illnesses that soldiers universally have. But you know what they said, nobody wants to be labeled with battle fatigue, right? Nobody wants that on their record. So nobody wants to be seen coming to see the shrink in combat stress. So what we did was, passed out these anti-stress kits to humanize what we do and break the tension. We also set up a little driving range on the base so people could swing by combat stress and whack a few balls and not have to be seen as a patient, but yet get some informal support. This is, some pictures of, quote, what I did on my summer vacation. I was very fortunate. When you are lucky, you return home from combat. When you're really lucky, you return in one piece. And when you're really, really lucky, you return and your family is there. All too often, families dissolve during combat deployments. 80% of divorces occur around, 80% of soldiers who are married dissolve their marriages in after deployment. So I've been very fortunate to learn the lessons that I have to be on speaking campaigns and work on various documentaries and educate the public around combat stress to both normalize it and destigmatize the natural occupational hazard of soldiering. Whenever I give this talk, I acknowledge two of my friends and colleagues who were killed in combat, both medics, Brian Allgood and Dave Cabrera, both killed in action. And, to underscore that, being a medic is dangerous, being in harm's way, and no one is immune from exposure to combat trauma. So why don't I stop there in recognition of the time, and we'll take questions after the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley. That was very compelling. It's difficult to watch those interviews, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right, we are going to transition now. Mayron, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And yeah, Dr. Bradley, this is it's very moving, and it's very it just points to the complexity of the topic, and how much still needs to be done for the population. Thank you for sharing this hard truth, I shall say. And I think I want to shift a little bit, not shift a little bit from the focus on veterans and just maybe amplify the discussion to other groups. Let me share my screen, and we might have to see if this will. I actually just want. Yes, I believe everyone can see it, right? And I just want to leave this up here for the discussion, and to try to bring this important discussion to to a different lens, and a different point of view. Now more focusing on the trauma experience than on veterans specifically. From Dr. Bradley's brilliant introduction, it's very clear for us to see how PTSD and the DSM is highly associated with the experience of people who have fought wars and people who have experienced combat stress or combat fatigue and things like that. So it's very clear how the DSM focuses, or the focus of the DSM on PTSD comes from this from this group that has experienced trauma related to war exposure and being fighting in wars. One thing that I started thinking a little bit more, so just give you a brief introduction to my education and history, and a little bit about myself. As Cole mentioned, I'm from Brazil, and I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to go and get my PhD in Switzerland. When I was in Switzerland, it was very interesting to see within my very first months there how some things that were very common where I came from, they were very common. Some like behaviors that were common for Brazilians, specifically for my community. When I arrived in Switzerland, I started seeing how a lot of them were pathologized, in the sense that what was really normal in my culture became problematic when it was being seen from a different perspective, and when it was being seen from different lenses. I stayed in Switzerland for a few years, and then I loved my time there, and it was so nice. I learned so much. Switzerland is definitely one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. They have great chocolate, great cheese, but I wanted to leave at some point. And I applied for a fellowship, and that's how I ended up in the United States. I came for a pre-doctoral internship at McLean Hospital. That's how I ended up getting associated with Harvard, and initially with Harvard Medical School. And it was, again, an opportunity to see how some cultural things that, again, were normalized or were normal in Brazil, just became pathologized when they became seen from a different from a different lens. And that all led to a course that I currently teach at the college. And for those of you at the extension school, we will be offering the same class for the extension school next spring. And it's called Intercultural Perspectives on Trauma. And what we do is really think about trauma from a multicultural lens. Um, Dr. Bradley talked about the core symptoms in PTSD. And I just want to remind us of all of that. So he talked about intrusive thoughts, and those are part of the core symptoms, which is really things that will come and then nightmares, we can't stop them. There are avoidance symptoms that are also part of the core symptoms of PTSD. There's also hyperarousal and like this bodily reactivity that happens, and of course negative affect, negative cognition. One of the things that I started seeing as I started researching psychopathology through different lenses was first that these core symptoms, some of these core symptoms, they may be more prominent in one culture or one ethnicity compared to other. And there's some interesting studies, for example, that have been done on different populations, looking at exposure to the same traumatic event and how they perceived and how they realized that different ethnicities, for example, even in response to the same traumatic event, will show different levels of each of those core symptoms. And it's very likely because some of these core symptoms, even though they're established as a core symptom in the DSM, they are more cultural, or they're more culturally related than biologically related. So Dr. Bradley briefly explained to us a little bit of the neurobiology behind PTSD. And it's very likely that these core symptoms that are more biological are the things that we see across cultures, such as the re-experiencing, for example, or the intrusive thoughts and intrusive behaviors that we see in PTSD. They could be more common across cultures, but there are others that could be completely culturally determined. So for example, avoidance, for example, as it is one core symptom in PTSD, but it also seems to be more prominent in Latinos, for example, than in white people. And one of the potential explanations for that is that culture determines what is a normal reaction to a potentially traumatic event and what is non-normative, what is a non-normal reaction to PTSD. And as we saw, as we've been seeing, this current diagnosis that we have of PTSD or post-traumatic stress it comes mostly from war veterans and people who have experienced war battles. However, when you look around the world, just because of the influence that the US and the Western world has on psychology, on psychiatry, and on psychopathology, even though this diagnosis was originally associated with people who were exposed to war, it's been used worldwide for people who experience other potentially traumatic events. And one thing that I like to do in this context, and mostly in discussions with my students, is to really point out to the importance and the relevance of culture when looking at symptoms of psychopathology, including post-traumatic stress. And I think this is a relevant discussion, especially for people in the extension school. I had an opportunity to teach a course at the extension school last year, and this was an online class. And it's nice to see a couple of students here that I had in the past. And it was very interesting to see how most of our students came from different parts of the world. We had students, I was waking up here and it was an early-ish class. I think for the college, 8:30 is a very early class. Kids will not, it's not a good time to meet with undergrads at 8:30. Um, I learned that after a few semesters. But at the extension school, it didn't really make a difference because while it was 8:30 for me here in Cambridge, I had students who were ready to go to bed or students who had to wake up in the middle of the night to join the class. Just showing how the diversity and the cultural diversity that we had. So I think this this type of discussion is super relevant, especially in this context of the extension school, to help people really think what are symptoms that are relevant, that are pathological in my culture that maybe are not recognized by the DSM, and what symptoms in the DSM are seen as pathological but in my culture, they're actually seen as normative. They're actually seen as a normal reaction to trauma. And I thought I would just share a few examples with you guys. I have a student who's now looking, he's from Vietnam. He got his graduate degree here, but he's currently back in Vietnam and as he awaits to go into his PhD, to get a PhD degree in Switzerland, following a similar path. And he's looking at another trauma-related disorder that is not PTSD, but he's looking at prolonged grief. And one of the things that we see in the DSM, for example, with relationship of prolonged grief is the length and the duration of the symptoms and how long it has passed since the person lost their loved one. When he started looking at his own culture in Vietnam, and I don't know if we have people from Vietnam here, and you probably know that a lot better than I do. But one thing that he saw is that there are specific events that happen post loss. And these events go past 6 months. They happen again they happen at 100 days. And even after a year, they're still celebrating and they're still mourning. And some of the symptoms that they present in these celebrations, well, they don't consider those symptoms, but some of the things that they present in these celebrations would definitely meet criteria, or at least most criteria for the development of a clinically significant trauma disorder. But when they're experienced within that culture, that is not the case. It's not the case that that would not be pathological. One thing that ends up, and this is one of the big issues that we have here in this field of research, looking at culture as a determinant of psychopathology, is that most instruments that we have, they are also based on Western psychology. A few years ago, and it's been actually over 10 years at this point, there was this interesting paper that came out that said, the title of the paper was "Most People Are Not Weird." And weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And what the author of the paper said was that while people in Western societies, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, while they represent about 12% of the world population, nearly 100% of research until very recently was mostly done within the 12%. And these findings were then generalized to the whole population. And this is also the case for instruments, right? So when we look at symptoms and PTSD or post-traumatic stress or a clinically relevant stress disorder across the world, the information that we have is very poor because unfortunately we are still measuring and that's all we have. And this is part of the discussion that I have with my students. I don't believe we have a ready answer at this point. So I think most of our discussions is really just to make ourselves and especially my students aware that, what we know when it comes to trauma and non-weird or non-Western cultures is probably very limited because we are measuring based on the experience and based on findings that we see in the West, in Western um, cultures. For example, Likert scales or Likert scales are something that are very common in the West, in America, and that might not even make sense in a lot of cultures. So asking people to grade how they feel in relationship to a specific situation or a specific sentence and ask them to rate from 1 to 7 or 0 to 5 or things like that may not make a lot of sense for a lot of cultures around the world. Also, the expressions of suffering or the way people express suffering is also, it also varies according to culture. There's something when we're looking at cross-cultural psych, and especially in relationship with trauma, that it's called idioms of distress. And these idioms of distress are certain expressions that are extremely relevant in the culture, but that are also very hard to translate. I usually give my students the example of an expression that we have in Portuguese, which means we would say coração apertado. And if anyone here speaks Portuguese, you understand it. And that means something like, I feel like my heart is being tightened. Um, and these expressions are potentially a way to explore and try to make sense and see if these expressions would help us understand trauma better in non-Western or non-weird populations. And there has been an attempt for that. So some people are trying to create some trauma-related questionnaires instead of using the DSM criteria for PTSD or for post-traumatic stress. They're trying to create instruments based on these expressions that are relevant to the cultures and are called idioms of distress. One thing that we have seen is that at least in the Cambodian population, and this is also work that the same student did, it seems that instruments that are based on idioms of distress are more sensitive to capture clinically significant and clinically relevant trauma syndromes. We don't know if that is being overestimated or underestimated because we don't really have means to compare. Well, compared with DSM-based instruments, idioms of distress seem to be able to capture more the presence of clinically relevant trauma syndromes. This is just, I think, my 2 cents here to try and bring awareness to this other side of psychopathology, not only associated to trauma, but associated with a bunch of other things, especially for those of you who are joining this conversation and discussion from the other side of the world or from a different country. It's really important that you, as a scholar, as someone who's learning about the topic, to really try to understand how can this be applied to my reality and what are important aspects from my culture that maybe are pathologized from different lenses and are not necessarily the case in my given culture, and what are other aspects that maybe because the DSM has not investigated or because the West has still not investigated these aspects, what are aspects that need to be relevant. We just recently published a study where we compared responses and association in psychopathology in a weird and non-weird sample. We found a lot of similarities. We found that how symptoms relate to each other are very similar, but there were some cases that were actually different. This is a topic for a conversation for another time. But yeah, I just hope you will consider these other aspects when working with groups that have experienced potentially traumatic events that are not necessarily within the war context. but are still presenting clinically relevant symptoms. I would love to thank everyone here for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel. I need to apologize. I mentioned to Loch as this is the last week of classes, so I have a bunch of events of students to get to. So I will have to leave soon, but I think here's my email if you want to reach out and if you have questions and you wanted to talk a little bit more about this. But thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you have 3 or 4 more minutes? Because we did get a question that came in that would be directed for, okay. So you indicated different symptoms across different cultures. And we are curious if there's any research or any indication that the types of treatments that are required would differ across cultures, and if the way that we are approaching it in the Western world is an entirely different way it needs to be approached elsewhere.
That's a very good question. I appreciate the question. And I think, well, and one of the questions that I usually like to ask people is, so if you imagine yourself as part of different cultural groups, right? So I am Brazilian and I'm also an immigrant in the US. Different groups seem to suffer and show suffering in different ways. So it's also it's also expected that different groups will heal and recover from things different ways. There's this very interesting book, and it's cross-cultural studies on trauma by Wilson. And I can send, or I'll ask Loch. I saw that Loch is here, and I'll ask Loch to maybe share with everyone because she knows which book I'm talking about. It's very interesting how they share different stories of people experiencing potentially traumatic events. And I love one example that they give in that book, which is, imagine we feel that it's very relevant when some community in another part of the world experiences a potentially traumatic event, and we as Westerners, we fly to those places to bring support based on what we know to be true for our reality and for our communities, right? The example that the author gives at one point is, how would people have felt if somebody from a small community flew into New York when the terrorist attack happened, and told them, hey, this is how you'll deal with this. We have this dance that we all do that will help us get better. When we look at the other way around, it seems quite weird that we would accept that type of help. Still, we assume that what we have to offer is good for the whole world. And unfortunately, most of the times that's not the case. In lots of cultures, it's completely surreal to think that people would be willing to pay an amount of money to talk to someone for about 50 minutes or 1 hour to deal with that issue, right? We do have a lot of interesting attempts to adapt Western-based treatments for non-Western samples. And these, I think, they're very promising. It's very likely that I'm very hopeful that they will work, but it's always important to consider cultural aspects also when dealing with healing. So, for example, in a lot of communities where more interdependent communities, symptoms or whatever traumatic event happened, they see as that sort of disrupts the community. And we do, as part of treatment in psychology, psychoeducation, right? Which is like, tell people this is the mechanism and this is the logics that we have for what's happening with you. It's very likely that in non-Western samples, it would be interesting to add culturally relevant explanations to their disorder or to the treatment, and also to use those as part of the recovery.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time
Okay.
and for fitting us into the busy schedule.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was very nice meeting all of you, Dr. Bradley, Dr. Bellet, and seeing a few students here. And hopefully I'll get to see some of you next year as well.
Well, again, thank you very much. And Benjamin, you now have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Cole, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I was really glad that Mayron led off with this discussion of the experiences of trauma that are outside of the dominant cultural discourse, because what I want to talk to you all about is just that. And a specific instance that formed the basis for my dissertation, which is what is going on with people who, instead of avoiding reminders of trauma, compulsively seek out reminders of trauma. So this research is not specific to a veteran population, but I felt it would be good to share it with y'all because my experiences as a veteran informed this research, because it's something that I believe I've seen a lot in my service. So before we jump into this phenomenon, which I'm going to refer to as self-triggering, right? That's the sort of shorthand for seeking out reminders, self-triggering. I want to talk first about just the current model of PTSD, which we've already talked about a little bit. So we believe currently that re-experiencing symptoms or these intrusion symptoms are the hallmark symptom of PTSD, this sense of, I see a reminder of trauma, and all of a sudden, in some sense, it's as if I'm back in it. I have this marked physiological reactivity, or maybe even a full-on flashback where I feel like I'm back in that context. And so it sort of makes sense that avoidance would be another symptom cluster within PTSD, because you'd be motivated not to re-experience the traumatic event. Further, we believe that although avoidance of reminders of trauma buys you some relief in the short term, in the long term, it reinforces the syndrome, because it's like you're teaching yourself over and over that the world is still dangerous and that the trauma memory still obtains in the context that you're in now. So accordingly, one of our most common frontline evidence-based practices is called prolonged exposure therapy. And prolonged exposure therapy entails essentially reversing avoidance symptoms, right? And so with the help of a supportive therapist, you confront reminders of trauma, you confront the narrative of the memory itself, and over time, hopefully what you get to is what we call habituation. So over time, your anxiety response to reminders of trauma reduces, and you can recover from the really severe version of the syndrome. So we have this post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis that's really predicated on avoidance as the orientation that survivors have to trauma. So when I heard about this in grad school, I was sort of puzzled, because I knew a lot of my friends who were vets that seemed to have a problem, quite frankly, with the exact opposite, which is to say seeking experiences over and over again that reminded them of their traumatic experiences. So some examples of this, and I'm not saying this applies to all veterans, but these are just some experiences I observed as an officer. Soldiers, when they get back home, getting into high-risk situations, like getting into bar fights or driving too fast, because it's in some sense reminiscent of the adrenaline rush they'd experience in combat. Playing video games or watching movies that remind them of combat over and over. We also have the well-documented phenomenon, Dr. Bradley mentioned nostalgia for home. There's also the idea of nostalgia for war, the idea of missing war and desiring to return to a combat zone. I also want to emphasize this isn't specific to military combat trauma. As I looked around online and looked through case studies, we do see instances of folks who have experienced things like sexual assault, who find themselves maybe over and over again watching episodes of Law and Order SVU, or continuing to find themselves in relationships with people who are similar to their abuser. So this idea of self-triggering really interested me. And so what we did first was we just ran a general online study recruiting folks from mental health related forums. And we said, look, if you've experienced trauma, we'd like you to be in our study. And within this study, we asked about PTSD symptoms, we asked about different forms of trauma, and we also asked about self-triggering behaviors. So I'll just breeze through this study really quick. What we found is that out of our entire sample, out of all the trauma survivors, a total of 545, we found that 74% of our participants had self-triggered at least once in their entire lives since the traumatic event. Obviously, there's probably going to be more folks who self-trigger in an online sample of folks who are already on mental health forums, but this suggests that the prevalence is probably non-trivial if it's this easy to find this many trauma survivors who engage in the behavior. We also asked an open-ended question about motives and just said, look, for those of you who do self-trigger, which was 360 individuals in the sample, why do you engage in this behavior? So people gave us all sorts of answers. Some were just a single sentence, some were paragraphs long. And we went through and did something called qualitative coding with a set of research assistants to try to extract themes of motives. Found a whole bunch of different themes. I'm just going to list a couple of the most prevalent motives here. One of them was meaning making. So we know that for many folks, the experience of trauma shatters basic assumptions about how the world works, such as the notion that God is benevolent or people are kind. And so because trauma shatters those basic assumptions and sort of shakes the foundations of how they think the world works, many people seek to make meaning, to go back to the traumatic event, to make sense of it. Why did this happen to me? What could I have done differently? And so self-triggering could be for some people a mode of meaning making. We also had a lot of responses speaking to the idea of self-validation, which is to say, this terrible thing happened to me. I don't know if I should call it trauma, and I don't know if my reaction to this event is normal. So it seems that a lot of folks are going online, looking at other narratives of other people who've had similar experiences and trying to figure out, is my response to this event justified, to validate their own experience. We also saw this motive, another pretty prevalent motive of what we call memory preservation. So this idea of intentionally making efforts not to forget a significant other person who was lost in a traumatic event. This idea of memorializing one's comrades from combat or other folks who are involved in any kind of traumatic event. Another interesting thing we found from this study is we ran some statistical analyses to see what's the relationship between self-triggering behaviors and post-traumatic stress disorder. What we found is those who had self-triggered had more severe PTSD symptoms than those who had not. So this suggests, obviously, this isn't a time series study. This is just, we measured all these things at the same time, but it does suggest that perhaps self-triggering is not really working like prolonged exposure therapy, that it doesn't seem to be helpful for PTSD symptoms. So that led to a few other questions. One of them is, okay, well, why isn't self-triggering working like exposure? How is it possible that this is making things worse for people? Another question was, well, how do we understand self-triggering as it relates to PTSD? Are there some people who are avoiders and some people who are approachers? Or can the same behaviors coexist within one person? How does that work? Now, I ran other statistically based experiments to try to get answers to those questions, but another thing I think it's important in research is having a lot of different methods. So I want to share, just to close out here, a case study, actually, of a veteran. I had a clinician from a local hospital call me up and she said, look, I read one of your papers on self-triggering. I'm treating this Vietnam veteran who's engaging in self-triggering behaviors, and would you like to do a case study? And I said, absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit about this case study, which I think helps us to understand a little more about self-triggering. So this person, the pseudonym here, I'm going to call him Kevin. Kevin was a Vietnam veteran in his early 70s, and he was being treated at a local VA. This is his first time in treatment. So this is a couple years ago. This is the first time since Vietnam that he was actually coming in for therapy. Kevin had been deployed to Vietnam. He had been in numerous firefights and had witnessed a civilian casualty, a young boy who was hit by a flare, and he thinks likely died as a result. So Kevin had not really left his house for the last 2 decades except for emergency situations. Very rarely left the house unless he really had to, and usually had to leave the house with his spouse if he was going to do so. So very pronounced avoidance behaviors. He's worried something bad was going to happen when he left his house. However, at the same time, Kevin was also engaging in what we think might have been a form of self-triggering. So what's Kevin doing while he's staying in his house? Well, he's on YouTube and he's watching videos over and over again of random violence erupting in public places. So for example, watching like a YouTube video of being in a Wendy's and all of a sudden someone starts swinging and freaking out. So Kevin listed a couple of different motives. One of these was Kevin found it very hard to understand how he could one day be in Vietnam, where there's this constant threat to his life, constant violence, and then all of a sudden he's in the civilian world in apparent peace, this sort of dread silence that visited upon him. And so he said watching these videos was a way of squaring these two realities, of making sense of, well, no, there's still violence and danger in the civilian world. Look, it's here on these videos, and I'm experiencing it right now. So this idea of perhaps opting for a more consistent world between combat and civilian life, even though it was a scarier one. Another motive that Kevin listed was he watched these videos to reassure himself that he's not crazy, that violence can happen anywhere. And so this idea of validating himself, validating his experience. Kevin also engaged in something sort of akin to self-triggering, which was every night before he went to sleep, he would purposely picture the boy who had died in his mind. And his motive for this was memory preservation, to memorialize the boy. He felt it was his duty not to forget this innocent casualty. So some of the takeaways from this, I think, are we can see how multiple motives for this behavior can coexist inside one person. So Kevin was fulfilling these motives of self-validation, meaning-making, and memorializing others. These are not bad impulses, right? These are impulses that we see in many combat veterans and in many folks suffering from other forms of trauma. However, the way that Kevin was engaging in these behaviors was reinforcing maladaptive beliefs that likely made his PTSD worse. So this idea, watching the YouTube videos of random violence was reconfirming this notion that, well, I really need to avoid the outside world. So the good news is that Kevin, over the course of this treatment, was able to heal to some extent. He had some spouse-assisted exposures where he would actually go out to grocery stores, go out on errands, and be able to disprove this notion that the world was dangerous. He also found other ways to memorialize the boy. One thing that he found helpful was to light a candle every night as a sort of symbolic way of paying his respects to the boy so that he could then dispense with the ritual of intentionally ruminating about the child in his mind every night. To close out, I just wanted to say that, veterans' traumatic experiences often happen in a much different context from that of civilian life that we return to. And this can often lead to difficulties in making meaning of trauma, as well as efforts to memorialize or validate our experiences. And these can sometimes be conducive to, I think, self-triggering behaviors. Self-triggering is probably not inherently pathological, but when it inhibits further healing because it reinforces these stuck beliefs about trauma that reinforce PTSD, it can sometimes go wrong. So the last thing I want to say is I think we don't necessarily want to reconsider the whole PTSD diagnosis, but maybe create a more inclusive understanding of what PTSD might look like that includes problematic approach behaviors as well as problematic avoidance behaviors. And then we can also work to modify treatments to accommodate people who have issues with self-triggering and perhaps understand their experiences better. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. That's sounds like a fairly new idea. We appreciate the new concepts here because that's not something I'm familiar with. Maybe I'm just not adequately educated, but I appreciate the new take on something that makes a lot of sense to me. So So we will jump into a Q&A here. I will plan to kind of just bounce back and forth. We've got 4 or 5 questions at this point. Dr. Bradley, the big stat you dropped on us that 80% of deployed combat veterans or combat soldiers end up getting divorced. We've had multiple people ask what kind of issues are appearing for those that do, what sort of role does like the lack of family support, or for those who stay married, what that additional family support provides for them. And we just love your more thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because let's also weave in the cultural perspective, right? That communities and cultures think about families and marriages in certain ways. And the military certainly has its beliefs around how to support families and what is beneficial and so on and so forth. All inherent in military culture is maybe perhaps a more conservative idea about when to get married and why to get married. Service members tend to get married at fairly young ages. And that may be to solidify relationships in the context of deployments and reassignments and geographic dispersion. There's also a financial incentive to getting married, that the soldier's pay goes up as a married service member. And particularly for young service members who are required to live in the barracks, they earn themselves permission to move out into either an apartment or on-base family housing. So there are many incentives to getting married, perhaps sooner than the relationship has matured to weather the storms of deployment. So that's certainly one aspect. And military culture has developed what they call family readiness groups or family support groups in order to support those families that remain behind and help them manage the stress of the separation and maybe single parenthood and child rearing and schools and all the rest. So the deck is really stacked against these young couples from the very beginning. And so it's really not a surprise that so many do end up in separation. You know, if you're a 19 or 21-year-old spouse and your loved one is deployed for a year, that's a long time from that young person's perspective. You know, when I deployed, I was in my 40s. And so even though I was gone for 13 months, my wife and I had been married for, over 15 years at that point, and and so a year's separation was not as threatening to us as it is for a younger couple. So a couple riffs on that question, but certainly be interested in hearing Ben's perspective as well as someone who has experience in this realm, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak anecdotally. I don't know as many statistics on this, but I'll just say anecdotally, as a platoon leader, on my first deployment in charge of an infantry platoon, again, this is more of an existential reflection, but the idea of mortality salience and the prospect of, okay, I'm getting ready to go somewhere, I'm not sure if I'm coming back. I do think that motivates people to make decisions that have major repercussions in the long term. These concerns about what will endure after I leave, what can I hold on to? And I will even say in my own personal experience, right, I was doing a lot of stuff that I would probably never do now, because my impermanence as a human was very much on my mind. And I think I don't want to be too pessimistic, but things like marriage and religion are certainly very much affected by our salience of our own mortality. Um, and I was also interested by, it's great that we have things like Skype and video chat now. And I remember my soldiers being able to keep in touch with their families to a greater extent, probably than in previous eras on deployment. But at the same time, someone mentioned dissonance before. What's the psychological effect of talking to your family on webcam and then having to go out on patrol a few moments later, right? So there were a lot of odd dynamics to particularly these young marriages on a deployment that I observed.
And for example, those video calls, would often, they tend to be, relatively few and far between, depending how remote your deployment is, right? And those calls are often fraught with problem solving. Billy's not going to bed on time and he's acting out, and can you discipline him from 6,000 miles away, and then take off the dad or the mom hat and put on the soldier hat, and then put your war face back on. I'll share one example of a Skype call gone wrong. I was Skyping with my family one night when we got when we received a mortar attack, and so we're on screen, and they hear the whizzing of incoming, and the screen goes blank because the comms were shut down. Anytime there is an attack, and certainly a fatality, comms are typically shut down for 24 hours so that families can be notified before the rumor mill picks up. And so, that was the case in this. And so I was unable to reconnect with my family to assure them that I was alive when all they heard was and blackout. So instantaneous communications, are fraught. It's not all good in connection, right?
Thank you very much for that. Ben, this question is for you. You mentioned a nostalgia for war, and that brought up a question of whether or not you think it would be beneficial to potentially screen individuals who are looking to re-enlist if their motivations for doing so are to potentially kind of get back into those sorts of environments that may do more psychological harm to them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I think that's a really tough one, because missing war, again, I don't know that it's necessarily indicative of someone who's at higher risk for PTSD or someone who's psychiatrically decompensating. There's a really great book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe. And one of his major questions in this book is, why do soldiers miss war? And he makes the point, and I certainly agree with him. I don't know if this is everyone's experience, but I know when I came back from Afghanistan, and I was living in a pretty smelly tent with a bunch of other soldiers, and you come back to America stateside, and it's a lonely, lonely culture we live in a lot of ways. Everyone's on their phone. No one really needs each other like they did overseas. So many things happen remote and impersonal, and I certainly started to miss being deployed. And I don't think that's actually altogether unreasonable. I think that nostalgia for war, or nostalgia for a combat deployment, is definitely a motive for why people re-enlist. It's definitely a motive for why people go into professions like law enforcement or EMT, right? This this intense interpersonal bonding that happens in these moments of trial and danger. So I don't know that nostalgia for war should necessarily be like a rule out for reenlistment, but it is an interesting idea about, and I don't know the answer to this, are there characteristics that would indicate someone is at higher risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder on subsequent reenlistments? And that's one of the tough, there's a lot of ethical concerns with screening people in or out for service, because there's a lot of risk factors for post-traumatic stress disorder. One of them is, are there previous traumatic events that you've experienced in your life prior to the military? Now that ups our risk for PTSD, but we wouldn't screen people out just because they've had a crappy childhood. So it's an ethically contentious question. And I'm not going to pretend I have a good answer on that, but thanks for the question.
Yeah, I'd like to pick that question up as well, because, I think one of the truths that we have to acknowledge is that the nation and the military don't really care about the occupational hazards that it exposes us to. The risk of cancer, hearing loss, death in combat, these are inherent risks of military service. And if you think about how we recruit people who have this inherent sense of invincibility, right? The few and the proud, be better than everybody else, be Superman, high tech, greatest military in the world, all of these notions of invincibility. And I'll interject sexiness. So there is very clear sex appeal in our recruiting apparatus that we rely on for young adolescent men and women to join. So the military is not at all interested in discouraging people from sacrificing themselves and putting themselves at risk. We do screening pre-deployment not to protect the individual, but to protect the unit. To protect the unit from a loss of personnel and combat effectiveness. Many people who join the military already have PTSD from adverse childhood experiences and previous traumas. So it's not a screen out. And this notion that we actually want to protect people from harm who serve, I think is a fallacy that has to be challenged. It's why we have disability compensation. And the nation acknowledges that war is bad for your health. And because it is bad for your health, we're not going to protect you from it, but we'll compensate you when it occurs. So that's a hard truth that has to be squared.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Dr. Bradley. And it's not an easy thing to, not something some folks want to hear, but yeah.
I am glad though that you brought up the VA disability, because that perfectly segues into the next question I had for you, Dr. Bradley. So the current VA disability lumps all mental illness into a single rating, and that brought up.
Nope.
No, well, sorry, I'm reading. And they are asking if there is any significant considerations for people who have multiple different mental disorders in various different issues, and both in treatment implications for that, and then also the difficulty in teasing out which symptoms fall under which issue.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the disability apparatus happens in two stages. One is in terms of your military service and whether you have incurred an illness that does make you, quote, unfit for military service. So say, for example, while you're on active duty, you develop bipolar disorder and you require treatment with medications that are unsafe to take in austere environments. You then become non-deployable and unfit for military service and can get a medical retirement from the military. So the military is paying your pension then. You may then apply to the VA for service-connected disability that would rate your bipolar disorder as service-connected. And if you had, traumatic exposures and developed PTSD, would rate your PTSD symptoms as if they're service-connected as service-connected, and any other conditions that you were that occurred while you were in service. For example, back pain, neck pain from wearing body armor and helmets and rattling around in Humvees, blown out knees from running and military service. Diabetes, if you happen to develop glucose intolerance while you were on service. So the VA will then, take a look at all of the conditions that that occurred while you were entitled to military pay, and rate you on that basis and provide disability compensation and medical benefits on that basis. Additional with the Compact Act that was just passed in 2020, the toxic exposures, depleted uranium, burn pits, water poisoning at Camp Lejeune, asbestos on naval ships, et cetera, et cetera. Simple exposure to those, whether or not you have developed symptoms related to them, also entitle you to disability rating and compensation. So all told, the max you can receive is 100%. And if you have a military retirement and a VA disability retirement, there's a determination made to who's paying what. For example, I collect a military retirement and I collect a VA disability compensation for the conditions that I developed, and we go on with that. So, and those processes continue to get refined. The criteria continue to expand, I always encourage people who have served to apply for the benefits that they've earned and deserved. Although to the casual external viewer, I may appear to be a fully functional human being, but I will still collect my VA disability without shame. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you you pointing out. I think it's very prevalent on like the VA disability subreddit and other things like that. That the kind of the misnomer that mental health is just a single thing. I appreciate the clarification there. Yeah. All right. Next big question is asking about prevalence of alcoholism in vets and any relationships to PTSD with that use.
Yes and yes. So let's talk about alcohol as a cultural. Let's use the term culturally bound syndrome. In North America, alcohol use as a way of coping and building friendship and community and relaxation is culturally bound and accepted. And so alcohol misuse grows naturally from that. So as typical as alcohol misuse is on a college campus, think about the military population as a college age cohort. Also drinking to misadventure, right? Irresponsibly and so on and so forth. Sprinkle in some traumatic experiences, and a way to cope and bond is around the use of drink, either to forget, to celebrate, to mourn, and various other modalities. It's interesting when you compare, for example, US and Canadian and British forces. The Brits report much lower rates of what we call the PTSD syndrome and much higher rates of alcohol use disorder in their post-combat cohort. Again, drinking is a sanctioned, accepted, culturally bound way of dealing with just about everything from celebrations to disasters. So alcoholism is a major problem. And here in the VA, I'll say the three mental health programs that get the most funding are for PTSD, substance use disorders, and suicide prevention. Even when fiscal belts are tightened, those are the programs that get funded.
Yeah, I can say anecdotally, we were sitting in a at a pier in Bahrain, and the Australian Navy was there, and they were just loading up kegs onto their ships. And even just in the U.S. Navy, we have beer on the pier. It's just such a common thing that feels very fully ingrained into the military culture. So it to me doesn't really come as much of a surprise that it turns into as big of an issue as it is. Thank you very much. All right, next one we have is for Ben. We have a question about religion, this concept of mortality salience, and whether or not individuals who are more religious may be less susceptible to PTSD.
Yeah, it's a kind of a controversial question on religion being a protective factor. If you're interested in this topic, on mortality salience, the sort of existentially oriented theory is terror management theory, which is this idea that I think it was Dr. Bradley that mentioned the concept of defenses. All humans as conscious creatures have to somehow square the circle of the fact that we're going to die one day, as will everything we love will pass away at some point inevitably. And so there's all these different modes of coping with that. One defense is this notion that there is some entity that's going to ensure the survival of my soul or the safety of my loved ones. I'm not saying religion is just a defense, right? But that is one of the functions it might serve. Regarding religion as a protective factor, I don't know much about the relationship between religion and PTSD, but the preponderance of empirical work says that on the whole, being religious, belonging to a religious community confers some of a protective factor for mental disorder writ large. But this is in between persons, which is to say in aggregate over the population, religion's protective. Now, I have done some research on the issue of suicide was mentioned, right? A lot of folks are grieving the loss of a loved one due to suicide. For them, religion and the religious communities of which they're a part can actually be a hindrance to their grieving process, because some religions come with a price tag, which is to say, well, if you kill yourself, you're going to hell. So religion can be a mixed bag. In aggregate, yeah, probably protective, but for the specific individual, it can be a very complex relationship. I'll just say anecdotally, right now I treat almost exclusively individuals with severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, catatonic depression. And I talk more about religion in that clinic than I have anywhere else. So a lot of folks are making meaning of their lives through religious modes. So I don't really think of religion as necessarily as good thing or bad thing, but if you have a religious orientation or outlook on life, integrating it into treatment is always a good idea. Because if it's part of the way you understand the world, I hope that as therapists we'll get more and more comfortable talking about religion in therapy. Anyway, those are my somewhat scattered thoughts on religion. I'll let Dr. Bradley add anything he.
Yeah, no, it's a great jumping off point, because you mentioned that religious frameworks often provide people a framework for the meaning and purpose of their life. And at the end of the day, that's what we are all looking for. Is there some meaning to our existence? And in as much as a religion, a philosophy, a cognitive framework can offer that, that is a good thing. And as you mentioned, the dissonance or conflict between say some religious tenets and an experience in life in combat, can often be fruitful in trying to reconcile and heal. So yeah, it is complex. It's and in as much as it provides a sense of meaning and purpose, I think is really helpful for people.
Thank you very much. Next one comes back to you, Dr. Bradley. Have you seen any differences or research on the differences between PTSD in war orientations or soldiers and just other forms of trauma?
Yeah, so there's a dose response, I'll say generally, as we understand the different types of traumatic experiences that are inherent in human existence. So the PTSD response from repeated traumatic incidents is much different than that of a single incident. Say, for example, exposure to a single natural disaster, a single motor vehicle accident, or a single sexual assault, for example. Because of the priming of the neural networks that occurs, a singular incident can be much more effectively isolated as a one-off, and not kindle as much of a brain on fire type of response than repeated traumas. The same is true for the time frame, the stage of life where the traumatic incident occurs. I mentioned that trauma that occurs in childhood creates much more pervasive and disruptive symptomatology than that once a person gains some level of mastery and maturity in their life, right? So there's a dose response and I would say a resilience factor as a protective factor in this. That being said, everyone has their threshold, right? And I'll point to the research of what's been called the land combat study by Charles Hogue and others. I think their first paper was published in 2006, which studied combat infantry brigades going into Iraq at that time. And what they learned was that there was a critical threshold for developing PTSD symptoms, and that was 6 firefights. That people who had fewer than 6 firefights tended to have much lower symptom burden and recover more quickly, and were more protected from developing chronic symptomatology than those who had 6 or more firefights. So again, a dose response, and recognizing that war is bad for your health. Again, one of the questions that came out of that is, should we limit the combat exposure of our soldiers? And while people might naively think that that is a good idea, it's antithetical to the way the armies work. And we want experienced leaders in combat. We want people who have been able to tolerate horrific experiences. We value those. We put medals on people's chest for those. It's a symbol of pride and dominance and masculinity and all the rest that is highly valued and culturally bound.
We just got another question that directly follows up with that in the chat, asking, is there something that makes that number 6 so critical in developing PTSD, or is it just that's just what it is?
Yeah. So in the logistic regression analysis of the data, that was the inflection point. So an interesting piece of data. And there's nothing particular about, okay, you're going into number 7. This one's going to, be the worst. It's just a cumulative effect.
Thank you, Professor Bradley. That's my question. Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Scully.
Okay. Let's see. All right. So this one we'll send to Ben, but I'm sure it'll get bounced back and forth. We have a question. What does an effective treatment team look like? Are there any opportunities for counselors to get involved with this population, individuals who have degrees in counseling as opposed to clinical psychiatry or clinical psychology, psychiatry, or social workers?
Yeah, I think I'm going to defer the bulk of that question to Dr. Bradley because I think he probably has a lot more experience in treating veterans specifically. I will say that one just general rule for good clinical practice, and something we really don't see nearly enough in public mental health, which is what I work in, is integrated care teams. Often we have, and maybe actually the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts may not be altogether different from the VA in that it is a massive bureaucracy. And a lot of folks come in for treatment with a presenting problem. They find themselves having to explain themselves to 15 different doctors, social workers, therapists, you name it. And there's this fragmentation of care. So what does a good treatment team look like? One that's actually talking to each other and to the client, and ideally to their family system from which they're emerging. I'll also just say, and I'll shut up after this, that a lot of the research just on treatment efficacy, broadly speaking, you do not need a PhD in clinical psychology or an MD in psychiatry to be a good therapist. Folks with master's level practitioner degrees, some studies have even said laypersons are about as effective at providing treatment as anyone else. So if you want to do treatment with veterans, I'm sure and I'm happy to talk more offline. I put my email in the chat, for if anyone wants to talk more about clinical careers, happy to do so. But I'm going to shut up now.
It's a great segue and a great question, and I resonate completely with your answer, Ben, that in terms of treatment teams, the things that are most important is their ability to communicate and collaborate and coordinate the care of the veteran or the person, and so I'll generalize, but let's talk about what the universal attributes of a therapeutic relationship are. And it is really divorced from the clinical credentials of the person. So far and away, in every study that has ever been done with so-called evidence-based psychotherapies and other interventions, there are some universal factors that hold true. And that is a caring and empathic relationship with the person, right? And so that can be a chaplain, that can be a peer counselor, that can be, it could be your bartender, like our World War II veteran said. Somebody that is seeking to understand you and help you make sense of your experience, right? That's it, really. And we have different modalities for doing that, and the goal is to find the holy grail of the particular interventions that work the best, so-called evidence-based psychotherapies. things that are easy to study get studied. Things that are more difficult to study do not. So the so-called evidence base is imperfect and biased. So cognitive therapies are much more structured and manualized, and therefore are more amenable to fidelity reviews and outcomes studies. Pastoral counseling, less so, not as well studied. Psychoanalytic treatment, psychodynamic psychotherapies, much more difficult to rigorously study their outcomes. So those don't get studied. But I can tell you the veterans that I treat that make the most progress are the ones where I particularly use a learning theory and psychodynamic approach. You know, what is the meaning and purpose of these experiences, and how does that tie to your life history, and what did you learn as a child that on the lap of your parents that inform your identity? You know, all of these types of questions. So again, things that are easy to study get studied and published, and things that are more difficult do not. Medications are a mixed bag. Anybody who's hoping for a pill being the holy grail will be as disappointed as I am 40 years into this work. Medications can nibble around the edges of problematic symptoms, but do not treat the disordered neural networks or the existential dread and grief that people are experiencing. So anyone can help, whether it's at the VFW hall, rape crisis counseling center, a religious organization. But if there are multiple people who are involved, each providing a piece of the puzzle, it is imperative that they work well together so the person feels understood.
Yeah, I just wanted to double underline what Dr. Bradley said. I'm very much psychodynamically and psychoanalytically oriented in my actual practice. And at the end of the day, we're talking about human relationships. And I don't think there's a clinical technique or a medication that's going to change that dynamic. It's about relationships.
Yeah, I think that segues perfectly into one of the next questions of these treatments that we're talking about and these individuals is the, well, certainly it's the goal, but are the outcomes curing of these issues, or is it just trying to mitigate as much of the problem as possible, but it's not really something you can necessarily get over?
So what we hope for is decreasing a symptom burden and increasing a person's engagement and level of functioning in their life, right? That when really terrible things happen, the goal isn't to erase them from our memories, but rather consolidate them as a positive part of our identity. In the population that I treat, you know, when our older veterans, you know, who have had, you know, reasonably successful lives and families and so on, when they age and they reach the stage where they begin to reflect again upon the meaning of their life, often these symptoms will return. Anybody who's seen Saving Private Ryan, where Matt Damon, as an old man, says, you know, was I any good? Did I do well? You know, that's the, you know, we're reminded of the Ericksonian stages there. Also, when we age and we lose some cognitive reserve, PTSD symptoms can often return in the context of neurocognitive disorders. And because the person's resilience and reserve has diminished some, and they're not able to flexibly manage their experiences as they had through most of their adult life. I'll share a personal anecdote with my dad, who was 2 tours in Vietnam, career Army officer, infantryman, Battle of Hue during the Tet Offensive, and had profound PTSD symptoms that he reconciled as an occupational hazard. It's simply part of being a soldier that we do this, and in that respect, it meant that you were actually involved in something meaningful from his perspective. And so he never really sought out treatment. He would talk with his friends about his experiences. He was, part of a military veterans group, and they all seemed to get one another, and they didn't really feel the need to cure one another. And so when I joined the military as well, and then when I transitioned to the VA, I'm like, hey, Dad, did you ever get your VA benefits? Oh, no. That's, there are guys worse off than me that need that. And I'm doing okay. Again, as a crusty old veteran himself, that was his cultural and culture-bound syndrome, if you will, and cultural perspective on his own PTSD symptoms. So PTSD symptoms are not in and of themselves pathological. If the person has meaning around them and has a life that they value and provides some sense of joy. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. Ben, do you have anything that you want to add to that? I want to cut you off.
Yeah, I want to make sure and answer as many questions as possible, but yeah, y'all are asking some really good, like, big picture questions, which I love, and I think it is an interesting ethical question, right? Like, what's the point of treatment? Are we in treatment to reduce your score on the post-traumatic stress disorder symptom checklist? Or are we here to try to help you understand your experiences in a way that makes life worth living, right? Those are not, they're quite often related, but there's a lot of financial incentives for funding, right? Like, okay, we're going to drop all this funding in here so that you can reduce the incidence of suicidal ideation and reduce the incidence of PTSD in our veteran population, right? That's now, for a lot of folks, reducing their symptom level is probably an objective, but that's financially speaking, an objective of the organization funding the therapy and research. Whenever I'm sitting in front of an individual patient, what brought them to therapy and what they want out of therapy can be as diverse as the people coming to therapy. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I try to have respect for that.
Thank you. All right, we have another big picture one. We have kind of a long question. I'll shorten it a little bit. We have this common stereotype, especially in TV, about this relationship between individuals with PTSD and a proclivity towards violence. Is there any real association between these things? And is that a difference? Are there any difference between what we see with maybe soldiers that have PTSD versus someone who was a victim of a crime in this relationship?
That's a really big question. And maybe I'll take a stab at it. That PTSD that results from interpersonal violence, whether that's being assaulted or being in combat, triggers a very natural wish to protect oneself and defend oneself. That can often lead to a triggering of anger, right? That's one of the ways that we naturally protect ourselves, by lashing out. So in as much as that system gets primed, there can be violent behavior that is expected whenever someone feels threatened. So we see this in our veteran population. We see this in assault survivors, and let's face facts that violent behavior is much more culturally bound in men than in women, but not exclusively. And everyone has the need to feel safe and defend themselves. So I'm not as familiar with the crime statistics associated with veteran versus non-veteran population. But what we do know is that in communities where crime is prevalent, and those communities are highly traumatized, it tends to perpetuate cycles of violence and crime, both within the home and within the community. And that work is well established. So trauma does predispose to violence in that respect.
Thank you very much. Now, excuse me, we're like right at the time that we said we were going to end on, and we still have a couple of questions left. I would ask anybody who wasn't able to get their question answered to Ben put his email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to him. And Dr. Bradley, are you willing to field some questions
right now? Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I think there's one question left that I think is a good one to end on. And this is about support resources. So it was mentioned that there are groups for veterans with PTSD, and we have a question about if you know of any resources for veterans or otherwise for getting help without having to see a therapist.
There are many resources. There are quite a number of applications that the VA has developed, and we haven't talked about tech in this discussion so far. But quite a number of applications that have been developed that don't require you to either be a veteran, be enrolled in VA. They're open source, available to anyone. Sleep and PTSD and depression and substance use. So there are quite a number of those that are really quite accessible. Communities of veterans often create support systems for themselves. Whether or not there is specific training involved in that, really, at the end of the day, we're all in search of meaning and purpose, right? And if you can find your tribe, as Sebastian Junger describes, you will be in a much healthier place than otherwise. So, and apart from clinical entities like Mass Mental, like the VA, and other places, veterans often receive great care through the VFWs and American Legion and other veteran services organizations, and the vet centers, which were created in the wake of Vietnam as a non-medicalized. They started as drop-in centers for quote rap groups, and that can tell you when they were stood up back in the late 60s and early 70s, and still to this day are great places of community. It's one of the reasons why the VA is such an important facet for veterans' lives. It also creates that sense of community. many veterans feel welcomed and at home when they come into a VA and see crusty old guys like me wearing our Army veteran hat and what have you. You know, community is important, and that in and of itself is healing. So I would say, you know, remember the apps, remember the vet centers, remember the veteran services organizations, remember the rape counseling centers and crisis lines. Remember, you know, the Red Cross for disasters. You know, these are all entities that are meant to alleviate suffering.
Thank you very much. Ben, I also want to ask you the same thing. You being local here, do you have any recommendations for local resources for anybody who might be on campus?
You know, as far as group therapies go, I love group therapy. I'm not really familiar. I'm sure that if you were to look online, I hate to tell people to go to Google, but Google probably knows more about this than I do. I guess I'm saying this because some folks don't want to seek veteran treatment that says treatment for veterans. Maybe they want to seek treatment in a context that's outside of that. I'll share my own lived experience. I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous through the 12 steps, and that's a free resource. It's not for everybody, but it was helpful for me because I didn't have to sit there and talk about the fact that I'm a veteran all the time. So there's definitely stuff in the community that emerges holistically, but I think that Dr. Bradley gave a pretty comprehensive list. You know, there's stuff like, just for more general inquiries, stuff like Psychology Today. It's amazing with search engines how specific you can get. If you want to talk to a Wiccan Puerto Rican therapist online who's trauma informed, you can like put those search terms in Psychology Today, and you can even search by insurance panel. So there's all kinds of stuff. And like I said, please feel free to reach out to me at my email. I'm always happy to do a brief consult or something like that. So
thank you very much, guys. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all of the valuable information. If you guys have any final words, I don't know if you want to say anything before we go, but I just want to real quick thank the psychology and the veteran student societies here at the Extension School put this together. We actually have the president, Chris Yousefi, of the Veteran Student Society is here with us today, as well as a lot of the psychology executive board. And I just wanted to thank everybody for help making this reality.